You know the headlines. They pop up every so often. Possible alien life found. And for a moment, it's absolutely thrilling. But it's almost always followed by this confusing wave of doubt and debate and retractions. Well, we're going to dig into a new paper that asks a really important question. Is there a better way to handle these huge and honestly kind of messy discoveries?
I mean, you've definitely seen a headline like this, right? Some weird new signal from deep space, a strange gas found on a far-off planet. It's one of those moments that just grabs everyone's attention. It's incredibly exciting.
But then, just as quickly, the other stories start to trickle in. The scientific community starts to weigh in, new data comes out, and that amazing, exciting possibility, well, it often gets replaced by a much more boring, mundane explanation. And you're kind of left wondering, what am I supposed to believe?
Yeah, this whole cycle, this whiplash of excitement and then disappointment, is exactly what a new paper is tackling. The researchers aren't asking, are we alone? They're asking a question that might be even more important for science right now. How can we handle these potential discoveries more responsibly? So, what does this study actually say?
Okay, so let's get into it. And to be really clear, this paper is not about finding aliens. It's a deep dive into the scientific process itself. It's asking, how can we get better at investigating these huge potential discoveries? And just as importantly, how do we get better at communicating them to everybody?
So the paper is focused on the field of astrobiology. And in that field, scientists are basically looking for two kinds of clues. You've got biosignatures, things like gases in an atmosphere that could point to life, and then you've got technosignatures, things like, say, a radio signal that would indicate some kind of technology.
So the real question this paper is asking isn't, is there life out there? It's something way more practical. It's asking, how can everyone involved, the scientist making the discovery, the wider scientific community, and the people communicating it to the public, how can they all work together to handle these really complex, high-stakes claims in a responsible way?
So how do you even begin to answer a question like that? Well, the researchers didn't run a new experiment in a lab. Instead, they did something else. They turned to history. The data for this study, if you want to call it that, comes from looking really closely at four famous and, let's be honest, famously controversial moments in the history of the search for life. By looking at the past, they could start to see some recurring patterns in how these things play out.
And here they are, the four case studies they dug into. You can see two biosignature claims, the Viking landers on Mars and that phosphine gas found on Venus, and two technosignature claims, the canals on Mars and the BLSC-1 radio signal. And for every single one of them, the authors looked at the whole life cycle of the claim, from the moment it was detected all the way to the final scientific consensus, or, in some cases, the lack of one.
And this timeline just drives the point home, doesn't it? This is not a new problem. From the so-called canals on Mars back in the 1800s, all the way to the BLC-1 signal just a few years ago, this challenge of how to interpret fuzzy data and talk about it responsibly, it's been with us for a very, very long time.
Okay, so after looking back at all these historical cases, what did they actually learn? What were the patterns? Well, they boiled it all down into some really crucial lessons and recommendations for all the key people involved when one of these potential discoveries hits the news.
First up, the scientists who actually make the claim. The paper says the most important thing is to be totally transparent about what you don't know. A good example is the Venus phosphine team. When they found calibration errors, they revised their findings pretty quickly, and the paper points to that as a really responsible move. It also says, don't overinterpret what you see, which is what Percival Lowell did when he turned some blurry lines on Mars into this whole story about an alien civilization building canals. And finally, you've got to protect your data from leaking out too early, which is what happened with the BLC-1 signal and created a total media frenzy before the science was even done.
But it's not all on that one team. The rest of the scientific community has a huge part to play too. The paper argues their job isn't just to debunk or shoot down claims, it's to be constructive, to propose new tests and new ways to follow up. It also warns against biases, like being too conservative and just dismissing a weird idea out of hand, because that can stall progress. It can be really hard to get telescope time to follow up on a controversial claim if the people in charge are just too skeptical from the start.
And finally, there's a huge piece of the puzzle that belongs to science communicators like journalists. The paper is basically begging them, please resist the clickbait headlines, resist the sensationalism. Instead of making it seem like a big fight between scientists, show it for what it is, a slow, careful process. Because highlighting the uncertainty and the real suspense of that journey can be just as interesting as a flashy, but probably wrong conclusion.
Now, this next part is really, really important. We have to be super clear about what this study is not saying, because getting this part wrong would actually undermine the very public trust this paper is trying so hard to build. So let's be crystal clear. This paper is not arguing that the search for life is pointless, and it's definitely not accusing scientists of being dishonest. Not at all. It's a call to make the process better. The real message here is that science, especially when the stakes are this high, just needs an incredible amount of care, transparency, and patience from every single person involved.
In fact, the paper makes a point to contrast this responsible way of doing things with pseudoscience. You know, pseudoscience is all about asserting you're 100% certain, having no real standards, and exaggerating everything for the media. Well, the responsible approach this paper is calling for, embracing uncertainty, methodical testing, peer review, is the exact, complete opposite of that.
So, when you put this all together, what's the big takeaway? Why does focusing so much on the process of discovery matter so much when we're talking about the search for extraterrestrial life?
Well, the answer really boils down to one critical thing: public trust in science. The search for life beyond Earth is one of the most profound, most fundamental questions we can possibly ask. And so getting it right, or at least handling the search with integrity and transparency, is absolutely essential for the credibility of science itself.
And that brings us right to the end. After walking through this whole analysis, the history, the missteps, the recommendations for the future, what is the most responsible conclusion we can draw? The authors, I think, say it perfectly. The discovery of extraterrestrial life, if it ever happens, will likely not be a single flashy eureka moment. It's going to be a slow, careful, methodical process. And on that journey, uncertainty isn't a failure, it's an essential feature. It's how you know you're doing science right. So the next time you see one of those crazy headlines, you'll know to look past the hype and appreciate the process.